So hello and welcome to a new chapter in inorganic chemistry. Today we're going to start talking about solid state structures, that is crystal structures and solids, and the arrangement of atoms and molecules in solids. When we're talking about a solid, we're of course talking about a three-dimensional array, a repeating three-dimensional pattern. And the question is, when you're talking about an array, who's making up the three-dimensional pattern? Crystallographically, when we talk about what's filling the 3D array, what we're talking about is known as a unit cell. And there are several requirements for the unit cell. First, it must fill all space. You have to be able to create the holes. You have to fill in all space. There can be no holes. Second, you have to be able to create the whole structure by taking the unit cell and moving it sideways, up, down, back, and forth, by translation only. Third, it has to be the smallest piece of the structure that can create the whole structure by just translation. And fourth, the cell has to reflect the actual characteristics of the crystal as well. Consider a nice array of circles extending out in all directions. What would be the unit cell for that structure? Well, you might pick on the part outlined in blue. That would certainly create the whole structure by simply moving it left, right, up, and down. And it does, of course, reflect what the whole structure would look like. The problem is that's not the smallest piece that would do that. If you look at the piece in green, that would certainly be able to generate the whole structure if you simply move that piece around. The problem is there's nothing about that piece that tells you how far or in what direction you should move it to get to the next piece. Does not reflect the whole. Which brings us to the red square, center to center to center on each of the spheres. This both tells you where all the spheres are and how far you have to move the square to get to the next full sphere. And so it is the small right-hand red corner that would be the unit cell for this structure. Let's consider another straightforward regular pattern and consider what would qualify as the unit cell for this pattern. Looking at the pattern, you might think the area outlined in red, like our previous example, center to center to center, would work for that structure. The problem is, while you could generate the whole pattern with that piece, the fact is you could not generate the corners. You'd have to rotate that square in order to get the whole square. And like we said, the requirement for the unit cell is it has to be by translation only, not rotation. So the little red square would not work. In fact, you have to use the square outlined in blue, more or less. That is, it has to include 4 of the squares to actually work, and then you can move the whole pattern to get the right answer. Consider this somewhat more complicated pattern. You'll notice that again, we could create unit cells. But this is an example where, in fact, you could create several unit cells, all of which would be perfectly acceptable and perfectly would work. You can make a cell touching where the 2 lizards' nose come together. You can make a cell going eyeball to eyeball. You can make a cell from where the elbow is. You can make a square from where the foot is. And this is the point and characteristic. The unit cell is not necessarily going to be unique. In this case, you could pick a whole bunch of different structure parts as the unit cell and be able to get the whole structure. So now we can look at a more complicated pattern. Fish, grays and whites. And consider all the gray ones the same color. Where would the unit cell be for this one? Again, like the last example, you could pick a number of different places to make your unit cell. In this case, I picked nose to nose to nose on the whitefish as the unit cell. And you could, in fact, create the whole pattern just using that cell. But that cell has a flaw. And the flaw is, if you look at that cell, you can rotate it 180 degrees and you end up with the same structure. The problem is if you look at where the tips of the wings of the fish come together, it's clear that you could get that pattern by rotating it not 180 degrees, but by rotating it 120 degrees. That is, the whole pattern represents a threefold rotation rather than a twofold rotation. So while that diamond would in fact create the whole structure, it does not in fact reflect the whole structure, and therefore does not qualify as the unit. To get a unit cell that both reflects the threefold rotation of the thing, of the cells, and is possible by translation, requires us to have a hexagonal shape to it, because the hexagonal shape also has the threefold rotation that we see the pattern form. To fulfill the requirement of filling all space in 3 dimensions, the first requirement is, of course, it has to fill all the space in 2 dimensions. That is, it has to tessellate the plane. And so the question is, what shapes will in fact qualify as tessellating a plane? Well, clearly squares will. And in fact, rectangles will also work as well. And in fact, we don't really need 90-degree angles. We can do with parallelograms. Any parallelogram will in fact fill the plane. Triangles will fill the plane, but triangles have a flaw. In order to fill the plane, you have to rotate them, and that's not acceptable. It has to be translation only. So even though triangles would fill the plane, they cannot be used as the base of a unit cell. And in fact, of course, the only thing other than parallelograms which will work as a unit cell is in fact hexagons. No other shape will fill the plane without rotation or some other modification. The requirement that the base be either a parallelogram of some kind or a hexagonal automatically limits the number of crystal structures we can have in 3 dimensions. And this is a list of all of the ones that are possible. These are known as the Bravais lattices. And they are varied by the length of the cell walls and by the angles at the different corners. Which brings us to the end of our opening lecture on crystal structures. Have a nice day, and don't forget to turn in the homework today.